The carriage wheel snapped in half and the horses reared in fright, and for one terrible second Eleanor Whitfield thought the whole world was going to tip over into the ditch beside the road. She grabbed the door handle and held on, her heart slamming against her ribs, while the driver shouted and the horses screamed, and the carriage rocked so hard she thought her bones would shake loose. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The carriage settled at a crooked angle, tilted into the mud, and silence fell over the country road. Eleanor pushed the door open with trembling hands and climbed down into the cold evening air. Her legs were unsteady beneath her skirts. She looked at the broken wheel, then at the frightened horses, then at the man standing a short distance away, staring at the wreck with an expression of pure disbelief. He was tall, dressed in a fine dark coat that marked him as someone far above her station, and his face had the kind of composed stillness that suggested he was used to controlling situations, not watching them fall apart in front of him. His own carriage, she realized, had swerved to avoid hers, and now sat half in the hedgerow, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern rather than anger. "No," Eleanor said, though her voice shook. "No, I am well. Are you?" He did not answer right away. He was looking at the horses, who were still tangled in their harnesses, thrashing weakly against the leather straps. Without another word, he strode past her and began working at the buckles, his hands quick and sure despite the fine gloves he wore. Eleanor hurried to help him, ignoring the mud that soaked into the hem of her dress, and together they freed the animals before either could be seriously hurt. When it was done, they stood in the darkening road, breathing hard, the wrecked carriages behind them like broken toys. "You did not need to help," the man said, looking at her properly for the first time. "Most ladies would have stayed inside and screamed for someone else to manage it." "I am not most ladies," Eleanor said, and then, hearing how strange that sounded, added quickly, I do not scream easily. My father says I have no nerves at all, which he does not mean as a compliment." A faint smile crossed the man's face, there and gone so fast she almost doubted she had seen it. "I find that hard to believe, given what you just did." Eleanor brushed a strand of hair from her face, aware of how she must look, splattered with mud, her bonnet knocked sideways, nothing like the elegant women who were usually seen speaking with gentlemen of his obvious quality. She had learned long ago not to expect admiration. She was the eldest of 3 daughters in the Whitfield family, and if there was one truth repeated to her since childhood, it was that her younger sisters had inherited all the beauty meant for the family, while she had been given practicality instead, as though the two could never exist in the same person. She did not mind it, most days. She had made her peace with being the sensible one, the one who managed the household accounts and settled disputes between the servants and read late into the night by candlelight, because no one expected her to attend balls or receive callers. But standing there in the mud, facing a stranger who looked at her as though she were something more than an afterthought, she felt an unfamiliar flush of self-consciousness. "I should introduce myself properly," the man said. "Nathaniel Ashbourne." The name struck her at once. Everyone in the county had heard of the Duke of Ashbourne, though few had ever seen him, since he spent most of his time at his estates further north, and rarely traveled through their quiet corner of England. She had imagined him older, colder, surrounded by servants and never lifting a finger for himself. She had not imagined him kneeling in the mud beside frightened horses, or smiling at a woman covered in dirt. "Eleanor Whitfield," she said, dropping into a curtsy that felt absurd given the state of her dress. "Miss Whitfield," he said, inclining his head. "I am in your debt. Without your help, I fear those horses would have injured themselves badly, and possibly us as well." "They are not out of danger yet," Eleanor said, glancing at the animals, who still trembled and shifted uneasily. "The gray one has cut its leg. It should be looked at soon, before it becomes infected." The Duke's steward, a stout older man who had been thrown from the second carriage but seemed otherwise unharmed, came limping up the road at that moment, cursing under his breath about broken axles and foolish drivers. He stopped short when he saw the Duke standing beside a mud-splattered young woman, both of them tending to the horses as though they were common stable hands. "Your Grace," the steward said, clearly startled. "Shall I send to the nearest house for help?" "Do that," Nathaniel said, "and ask whose land this is. We cannot leave these horses standing in the cold." "It is my father's land," Eleanor said. "The Whitfield estate is just beyond that hill. It is not grand, but there is a stable, and my father would never forgive me if I let injured horses stand in the road when shelter was so near." And so it was decided, with little ceremony and less fuss, that the Duke of Ashbourne and his steward would spend the night at the modest home of a country gentleman whose name meant nothing in fashionable circles, all because of a broken wheel and a woman who could not resist mending things. The walk to the house was short but eventful, filled with careful conversation as they led the limping horses along the darkening road. The Duke asked her about the estate, about the harvest that year, about the state of the roads, and she answered plainly, without the practiced flattery she had seen other women use with important men. She told him the roads were poorly maintained because the local council could not agree on how to divide the cost, and that the harvest had been middling, better than the year before but still not what it should be. He listened as though her answers mattered, nodding along, occasionally asking a sharper question that revealed he understood estate matters better than she expected from a man of his rank. When they reached the house, her father came rushing out at the sound of unfamiliar voices, alarmed to see his daughter leading 2 enormous horses and 2 unfamiliar men up the drive. Explanations were made, apologies exchanged, and within the hour the household had transformed itself around the unexpected guests. Eleanor's mother fretted over what to serve for supper. Her younger sisters peered down from the upstairs landing in open curiosity, and the Duke of Ashbourne sat calmly in their modest parlor as though he dined in such houses every day of his life. Eleanor changed out of her ruined dress and returned downstairs, feeling plain in her second-best gown next to the fine tailoring of their guest, but if he noticed, he gave no sign of it. Supper was a strange, lively affair. Her father spoke too much about the state of the county roads, her mother apologized too often for the simplicity of the meal, and her sisters, Charlotte and Alice, tried valiantly to draw the Duke into conversation about fashionable topics he clearly had little interest in. It was Eleanor he spoke to most, asking her opinion on a book he noticed on the parlor shelf, a heavy volume on agricultural improvement that her sisters found deeply boring but that she had read twice. She answered honestly, describing which of the author's suggestions she thought impractical and which had merit, and watched with quiet surprise as the Duke leaned forward, genuinely engaged, arguing a point with her as though she were an equal and not merely a young woman expected to nod along politely. Later that night, after the household had settled and the guests had retired to the 2 best bedrooms, Eleanor sat by her window, staring out at the horses resting in the stable below, and thought about the strange turn the day had taken. She told herself firmly that it meant nothing. A Duke, thrown briefly into her path by an accident of broken wheels, would vanish back into his own world the moment the roads were repaired and his carriage fixed. Men like that did not linger in the lives of women like her. She did not know, as she finally fell asleep, that Nathaniel Ashbourne lay awake in the guest room down the hall, thinking not of his ruined carriage or his delayed journey, but of a woman, with mud on her hem and quiet confidence in her voice, who had argued with him about crop rotation as though nothing in the world could intimidate her, and who seemed entirely unaware of how rare that made her. In the morning, when the wheelwright arrived to repair the broken carriages, the Duke lingered longer than the repairs required, watching Eleanor move about the stable yard checking on the injured horse, refusing to let anyone rush her away before she was satisfied the animal would heal properly. When at last he climbed into his mended carriage to continue his journey, he paused with one hand on the door. "I hope our paths cross again, Miss Whitfield," he said. Eleanor, standing in the yard with dirt still under her fingernails, gave him a small, honest smile. "That seems unlikely, Your Grace, given how different our worlds are." "Perhaps," he said, "but unlikely things happened yesterday, and here we both are." He climbed into the carriage before she could think of a reply, and she stood watching the wheels turn down the drive until they disappeared around the bend, wondering why her chest felt so tight, and telling herself, without much success, that it was only the cold morning air. Back inside the house, her sisters were waiting, both of them practically vibrating with questions. Charlotte, the younger of the 2, could not sit still. "A Duke, Eleanor, an actual Duke, sitting in our parlor, and you spent the whole evening talking to him about turnips and crop rotation. Did you not think to speak of anything more agreeable?" "He asked about the book," Eleanor said simply, untying her bonnet. "I answered him." "You could have smiled more," Alice offered, not unkindly. "Men like that are used to being flattered." You looked at him as though he were any ordinary caller. "He is not an ordinary caller," Eleanor said, "but I saw no reason to pretend I knew nothing of the subjects he raised simply because he holds a title. If he wished for flattery, I imagine he receives enough of it elsewhere." Her mother, overhearing this from the doorway, looked faintly scandalized, though whether at the conversation itself or at the notion that a Duke had sat at their table discussing agricultural improvement, Eleanor could not say. "You must be careful, my dear," her mother said. "Men of his rank do not call twice on families such as ours without reason, and I would not have you build hopes on a night's shelter from the rain." "I have built no hopes, mother," Eleanor said, and believed it, mostly. He was a stranded traveler, nothing more. By tomorrow he will be back among people of his own circle, and this house will be nothing more than a place he stopped once, out of necessity. But even as she said it, she found herself returning to the stable that evening, long after her sisters had gone to bed, checking once more on the injured horse that was no longer there, running her hand along the empty stall where it had stood, and wondering, despite every sensible argument she made to herself, whether unlikely things truly could happen twice. A letter arrived at the Whitfield house 3 weeks later, and the moment the housemaid placed it on the silver tray in the hall, the whole household seemed to hold its breath. "It bears a crest," Charlotte said, snatching it up before anyone else could reach it, turning it over in her hands as though the wax seal might crack open on its own and reveal its secrets. "Eleanor, it is addressed to you." Eleanor's stomach tightened. She took the letter carefully, aware of her mother hovering just behind her shoulder, of Alice leaning in from the other side, of her father pretending not to care from behind his newspaper while clearly listening to every word. She broke the seal and read quickly, then read again, because the first time her mind refused to believe what her eyes told her. The Duke of Ashbourne wrote to say that he had not forgotten the kindness shown to him during his unfortunate accident, and that business regarding a neighboring property brought him back into the county. He wondered, with careful and formal politeness, whether he might call upon the family to thank them properly, and whether Miss Whitfield in particular might recommend a book on estate management, since he had thought often of their conversation and wished to continue it. "He wishes to continue a conversation," her mother repeated slowly, as though testing the words for hidden meaning. "About books." "That is what it says," Eleanor said, folding the letter and trying to keep her voice steady, though her pulse had picked up in a way she did not entirely welcome. "Dukes do not write to young women about books," her father said from behind his newspaper, "unless they have some other reason for writing at all." Eleanor told herself firmly that her father was simply being fanciful, the way parents sometimes were when a title crossed their threshold even briefly. But when the Duke's carriage rolled up the drive 4 days later, and he stepped down looking exactly as composed and unhurried as she remembered, she found her fanciful explanations harder to maintain. He brought a small gift for the household, a set of illustrated botanical prints that he claimed had reminded him of the gardens he had glimpsed on his last visit, though Eleanor suspected the gardens had made little impression on him at all, and the gift was simply an excuse to have something to bring. He stayed for tea, then for a walk around the grounds at her father's insistence, and somehow, without either of them quite arranging it, Eleanor found herself walking beside him along the same hedgerow where his carriage had broken down weeks before. "I confess I had another reason for returning," Nathaniel said, as they walked past the stable where the horses had once stood trembling and afraid. "The property business could have been settled by letter. I chose to attend to it myself." "That seems an inefficient use of a duke's time," Eleanor said, "traveling so far simply to sign papers that could have been sent by post." "Perhaps I am not always efficient," he said. "Perhaps some things are worth the inconvenience." She did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and they walked in a silence that felt far less awkward than it should have, given how little either of them knew what to say next. Word of the Duke's second visit spread through the county faster than either of them could have anticipated. Eleanor's cousin Margaret Ellery, who lived 2 miles away and had always considered herself the most accomplished young lady in the neighborhood, arrived at the Whitfield house the very next morning, under the transparent pretense of borrowing a pattern for embroidery. "I hear the Duke of Ashbourne called on you again," Margaret said, settling into the parlor with the air of someone conducting an interrogation disguised as friendly conversation. "Twice now, I understand. How extraordinary." "He had business in the area," Eleanor said carefully. "Business," Margaret repeated, with a small, disbelieving laugh. "Eleanor, dear, I do not say this to wound you, but you must see how strange it appears. A man of his standing does not simply happen to have business near your father's modest house on 2 separate occasions, unless of course the business is something else entirely." "And what would that something else be?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice light though she felt heat rising in her cheeks. Margaret's smile did not reach her eyes. "I could not say. Though I imagine most gentlemen of his rank prefer companions who can offer them something more than conversation about turnips and old books. Perhaps he simply finds you restful, the way one finds an old armchair restful. Nothing more is required of it than to sit quietly and not demand attention." The words stung more than Eleanor wanted to admit, precisely because they echoed the quiet fear she had been carrying since the Duke's first visit. The fear that she was reading far too much into ordinary politeness, that a man like Nathaniel Ashbourne could never truly be drawn to a woman like her, when the county was full of prettier, more fashionable young ladies eager for his attention. Margaret, who had always resented not being the prettiest or the wittiest, seemed to sense exactly where to press. "I am glad you have taken such interest in my situation," Eleanor said evenly, refusing to give Margaret the satisfaction of a visible wound. Though I confess I had not thought much about it myself, beyond enjoying a pleasant conversation with a guest. Of course, Margaret said sweetly. How sensible of you not to hope for anything more. After Margaret left, Eleanor sat alone in the parlor for a long while, staring at the botanical prints the Duke had brought, trying to decide whether her cousin's cruelty had been born of genuine concern or simple jealousy. She suspected the latter, though the suspicion did little to ease the doubt now curling in her chest. The Duke called again the following week, and again the week after that, each visit accompanied by some small pretext, a book he thought she might enjoy, a question about a local charity her mother had once mentioned, an update on the injured horse that had fully recovered under her care. Eleanor began to notice things about him that had nothing to do with his title. He listened more than he spoke. He asked her opinion and then genuinely considered it, sometimes changing his own view when her argument proved sound. He was quieter than she expected a man of his position to be, as though the weight of his responsibilities sat heavier on him than most people realized. During one visit, walking along the same stretch of road where they had first met, he spoke of his family, something he had not done before. His father had died when he was young, leaving him the title and the estate far earlier than he had been prepared for, and his mother had passed only a few years later. He had a cousin, Edmund, who managed certain matters for him when business called him away, though Nathaniel spoke of Edmund with a careful neutrality that suggested more complicated feelings than he wished to share. It must be lonely, Eleanor said, before she could stop herself, carrying all of that responsibility with no one to share it. Nathaniel looked at her then with an expression she could not quite name, something between surprise and gratitude, as though no one had said such a thing to him in a very long time. It is, he admitted. Most people see the title before they see anything else. They speak to the Duke, not to the man standing in front of them. I see a man who worked buckles loose from a frightened horse's harness with his own hands rather than waiting for a servant to do it, Eleanor said. That told me more about you than your title ever could. They stood together in the quiet lane, and for a moment, neither of them moved to continue walking, both aware that something had shifted between them, something neither was quite ready to name aloud. But not everyone in the county shared Eleanor's growing certainty that the Duke's attentions were genuine. Whispers followed each of his visits, growing louder and less kind, and Margaret was not the only one to suggest that a man of his rank could not possibly be serious about a woman so ordinary in appearance and unremarkable in fortune. Eleanor heard the whispers secondhand, through her sisters, through servants who repeated gossip they overheard at the market, through the careful, pitying looks of neighbors who clearly expected the whole affair to end in humiliation. She told herself the whispers did not matter. She told herself, lying awake at night, that Nathaniel's opinion was the only one that counted, and that his opinion, as far as she could tell, had not wavered once since the night his carriage broke down outside her father's gate. But doubt has a way of settling into even the steadiest hearts, and Eleanor found herself, more often than she liked, staring at her reflection in the glass and wondering what exactly a duke could see in a face the rest of the county had long ago decided was plain. A small gathering was held that month at the home of Lady Pembroke, a widow of considerable standing who hosted the sort of modest evening parties that drew everyone of any consequence within 10 miles. Eleanor had never much enjoyed these events, since her sisters were always the ones admired for their dancing and their conversation, while she was left to sit near the older women, discussing weather and harvests with anyone polite enough to include her. This time, however, the moment she entered the room, she felt eyes turned toward her, and not with the usual polite indifference. "Miss Whitfield," Lady Pembroke said warmly, taking both her hands. "I hear you have had a most distinguished visitor these past weeks. You must tell me everything." Before Eleanor could answer, a ripple of interest moved through the room, heads turning, voices dropping to that particular register reserved for gossip too delicious to say aloud. She caught fragments of conversation as she moved toward the refreshment table. Someone wondered aloud whether the Duke had lost a wager. Someone else suggested he was simply amusing himself before returning to more serious considerations in town. Margaret, standing near the fireplace in a gown clearly chosen to outshine everyone present, offered her own theory to a small circle of listeners, loud enough to ensure Eleanor heard every word. "I have always thought men of high rank sometimes tire of being flattered," Margaret said, with the air of someone offering deep wisdom. "Perhaps it amuses his grace to spend time somewhere he need not perform for anyone. My cousin asks for nothing, expects nothing, so of course he finds her company undemanding. It is hardly the same as genuine regard." Eleanor felt the words land like small, precise blows, each one aimed at the soft, uncertain place in her chest where hope had begun, cautiously, to take root. She kept her expression calm, thanked Lady Pembroke for the invitation, and made her way to a quiet corner near the window, where she could watch the room without being watched in return. It was there that Sophie Ainsley found her, a young woman a year or two younger than Eleanor who had always been kind, if a little shy, and who now sat down beside her without invitation. "Do not listen to Margaret," Sophie said quietly. "She has wanted to be the most admired woman in this county since she was 12 years old, and it has curdled something in her. I have watched the Duke look at you, Eleanor. It is not the look of a man who is merely undemanded of. It is the look of a man who has finally found someone worth demanding something from himself." Eleanor managed a small, grateful smile, though the doubt Margaret had planted did not fully leave her that evening, nor for several evenings afterward. Meanwhile, at Ashbourne Hall, matters were unfolding that Eleanor knew nothing about. Nathaniel's cousin Edmund, a restless man some years older than the Duke, had grown increasingly interested in the family's affairs since hearing rumors that Nathaniel had taken an interest in a young woman of no particular fortune or connection. Edmund had long assumed that Nathaniel's eventual marriage would be arranged carefully, to a family whose alliance would strengthen the estate's holdings, and by extension, secure Edmund's own comfortable position as a trusted relation managing certain financial matters in the Duke's frequent absences. "You cannot be serious about this," Edmund said one evening, standing in the study at Ashbourne Hall with a glass of brandy he had poured without asking. "A country gentleman's daughter, with no title, no significant fortune, no connections that could benefit the estate in any meaningful way. People will say you have lost your senses. People said the same when my father chose to modernize the tenant farms instead of raising rents," Nathaniel said evenly, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "People say a great many things, Edmund. It has rarely stopped me from doing what I believe is right." "This is not tenant farms," Edmund pressed. "This is the future of the entire estate. Marriages of consequence exist for a reason." "And what reason is that?" Nathaniel asked, finally lifting his gaze. "To ensure that titled families continue trading daughters like livestock, so that men like you may continue managing accounts and drawing a comfortable salary from an arrangement that benefits everyone but the two people actually expected to live together for the rest of their lives." Edmund's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further that evening, though the look he gave his cousin before leaving the room suggested the matter was far from settled in his mind. Whatever plans Edmund had quietly begun forming, he intended to see them through, regardless of what Nathaniel believed he wanted for himself. Back in the quiet corner of the county where none of this maneuvering was yet visible, Eleanor continued to receive the Duke during his visits, continued to walk with him along familiar lanes, continued to feel, despite every whisper and every doubt Margaret so carefully planted, that something rare and unlikely was growing between them, fragile as new growth after a hard winter, and just as easily crushed if the wrong storm arrived before it had the chance to take root. The teacup shattered against the floor before Eleanor even realized her hand had trembled, the porcelain scattering across the parlor rug in a dozen pale shards, and for a moment she simply stared at the mess, her ears ringing with the words she had just overheard through the open window. She had not meant to listen. She had stepped out onto the side terrace to cut fresh flowers for the table, and the voices had carried clearly from the open drawing-room window of the neighboring house, where her Aunt Winslow was entertaining several ladies from town. Eleanor had recognized the topic immediately, the way one recognizes a wound reopening. "I heard it from someone who attended the assembly in town," one of the voices said, a woman Eleanor did not immediately place. The Duke of Ashbourne apparently made quite a joke of it among his friends there, saying he had found the plainest, dullest creature in the county, and intended to see how long he could keep up the pretense of courting her before growing bored. "How cruel," another voice said, though it did not sound especially troubled by the cruelty, more delighted by the scandal of it. "Poor Miss Whitfield. I always did think it strange that a man of his standing would trouble himself with her." "Some men enjoy such games," the first voice continued. "It amuses them to raise a plain woman's hopes simply to watch her fall when the truth becomes clear. I would not put it past a man so used to having whatever he wishes." Eleanor had returned to the parlor with the flowers still uncut in her basket, her hands unsteady. And it was there, moments later, setting down her teacup with far more force than she intended, that the porcelain shattered against the floor. Her mother rushed in at the sound, followed by Charlotte, both exclaiming over the mess, neither noticing at first how pale Eleanor had gone. "I am well," Eleanor said, kneeling to gather the broken pieces before anyone could stop her, grateful for the excuse to keep her hands busy and her face turned away. "It slipped, that is all." But it was not all, and by evening the story had reached her in 3 separate forms, each slightly different, each equally humiliating, repeated by servants who had heard it from other servants, by neighbors who professed sympathy while their eyes gleamed with curiosity, by her own cousin Margaret, who called that same afternoon with an expression of exaggerated concern that fooled no one. "I only tell you because I would want to know were I in your position," Margaret said, settling into her usual chair with obvious satisfaction. "It is being said quite openly in town that the Duke made a wager with his friends, something about seeing how far a woman of your circumstances might be led to believe herself worthy of a Duke's genuine regard. I cannot say whether it is true, but I thought you should hear it from family, rather than from strangers." Eleanor sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, refusing to give Margaret the satisfaction of visible distress, though inside she felt something cold and heavy settle over the fragile hope she had allowed herself these past weeks. She thought of every conversation she had shared with Nathaniel, every walk along the hedgerow, every moment she had believed, however cautiously, that his attention meant something real. Had all of it been a performance for an audience she could not see, a joke told among men who found amusement in a plain woman's foolish hope? "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said finally, her voice admirably steady, "though I would ask you not to repeat such things further, whether or not you believe them yourself." Margaret left soon after, and Eleanor spent the remainder of the day in a fog of quiet misery, unable to concentrate on her needlework, unable to eat more than a few bites at supper, unable to stop the cruel voice in her head that whispered Margaret's version of events sounded exactly like something a woman with no fortune and no beauty should have expected all along. She did not see Nathaniel for 8 days after that. His last visit had ended with vague talk of business requiring his attention at Ashbourne Hall, and though he had promised to return within the week, the days passed with no letter, no carriage rolling up the drive, nothing but silence that seemed to confirm every cruel whisper circulating through the county. Eleanor told herself she should be relieved. If the rumors were true, better to learn it now, before her heart had invested more than it could afford to lose. But relief did not come, only a hollow, aching disappointment that she was ashamed to feel, given how firmly she had told herself, from the very beginning, not to hope for anything at all. What Eleanor did not know was that Nathaniel's absence had nothing to do with wagers or cruel amusement, and everything to do with a crisis unfolding at Ashbourne Hall that demanded his immediate attention. Edmund, growing increasingly desperate as Nathaniel's visits to the Whitfield estate continued despite every argument raised against them, had taken matters into his own hands, quietly approaching several of the Duke's tenants with false claims that Nathaniel intended to raise rents significantly to fund what Edmund described, with careful exaggeration, as an unsuitable romantic entanglement that would drain the estate's resources. The resulting unrest among the tenants had grown serious enough that Nathaniel was forced to travel from farm to farm, correcting the falsehoods and reassuring frightened families that no such changes were planned, all while trying to determine exactly how such damaging rumors had begun circulating in the first place. It took him the better part of a week to trace the rumors back to their source, and when he finally confronted Edmund in the study at Ashbourne Hall, the argument that followed was sharper and more bitter than any they had exchanged before. "You would frighten my own tenants, risk their trust in me, simply to prevent a marriage you have decided you dislike?" Nathaniel demanded, his composure, usually so steady, cracking under genuine anger, for perhaps the first time Edmund had ever witnessed. "I did what was necessary," Edmund said, though even he seemed less certain of his own justification than he had a week before. "You are not thinking clearly, Nathaniel. This obsession with a plain country woman will cost you everything you have worked to build." "She is not an obsession," Nathaniel said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. "And you will not speak of her again in this house, nor spread another word about my personal affairs to anyone under my employ. If you do, you will find yourself managing accounts for a much smaller fortune than the one you currently enjoy, and considerably further from Ashbourne Hall than you would like." Edmund left the room without another word, though the resentment simmering beneath his careful composure had not lessened, only retreated to wait for a better opportunity. It was during this same difficult week that a letter finally arrived at the Whitfield house, delivered not by the Duke's usual messenger, but by his own hand, since he had ridden through the evening rather than wait another day to correct whatever misunderstanding his silence might have caused. He arrived unannounced, his horse lathered from hard riding, his coat dusty from the road, looking nothing like the composed, unhurried man Eleanor had first met beside the broken carriage. "I must apologize for my absence," he said, as soon as she came to the door herself, drawn by the commotion of an unexpected rider arriving so late in the evening. "Matters at the estate required more time than I anticipated, and I feared my silence might have been misunderstood." Eleanor stood in the doorway, torn between relief at seeing him and the lingering sting of everything she had heard over the past week. unable to fully release the doubt that had taken root in his absence. "There has been talk," she said carefully. "Talk of wagers, and jokes made at my expense among your friends in town." Something flickered across Nathaniel's face, not guilt, but a weary recognition, as though he had feared exactly this. "There is no wager," he said firmly. "There has never been a wager, nor any joke made at your expense that I am aware of. I do not know who began such a story, but I promise you, on my father's memory, that nothing about my regard for you has been a performance for anyone's entertainment." Eleanor searched his face in the lantern light, looking for the deception Margaret's story had convinced her must be lurking somewhere beneath his words, and found instead only exhaustion, and something that looked very much like fear that she might not believe him. "I want to believe you," she admitted quietly. "Then believe me," he said, "not because I ask it, but because I have given you no reason yet to doubt it, whatever cruel stories others may invent to explain something they cannot otherwise understand." They stood together at the threshold for a long moment, the night air cool around them, the doubt slowly easing from Eleanor's chest even as new uncertainty took its place, a growing awareness that whatever was happening between them had attracted enemies neither of them had fully accounted for, and that the road ahead, however genuine his affection proved to be, would not be an easy one to walk. Nathaniel could not stay long, given the lateness of the hour and the impropriety of a gentleman lingering at an unmarried woman's door after dark, but before he left, he told her more than he had ever shared before, standing there in the lantern light with his horse waiting patiently behind him. He spoke of Edmund, of the false rumors spread among the tenants, of the argument that had finally forced the truth into the open between them. He believes a marriage should serve the estate first, and the two people involved second, if at all, Nathaniel said. "It is not an uncommon view among men of his generation, though I have never shared it. My own parents married for exactly such reasons, and though they were not unkind to one another, I do not believe either of them ever knew real happiness in the arrangement. I have no wish to repeat their example." "And your cousin will not simply accept your decision," Eleanor said, understanding without needing to be told that the danger to their fragile understanding had not passed simply because one confrontation had ended. "No," Nathaniel admitted, "I do not believe he will. But I would rather face his disapproval honestly than let it dictate a life I do not want." He left soon after, promising to call again within days rather than weeks, and Eleanor watched his horse disappear down the dark lane before retreating inside, where her father waited in the hallway with an expression somewhere between concern and curiosity. "That was an unusual hour for a caller," her father said carefully. He wished to correct a misunderstanding, Eleanor said, and found herself, for the first time, telling her father everything, the rumors about wagers, the whispers Margaret had so eagerly delivered, the truth Nathaniel had just confessed about his cousin's interference. Her father listened without interrupting, his expression growing graver as the story unfolded. "I confess I have wondered these past weeks whether we were encouraging something that could only end badly," he said, once she had finished. "A duke's world is not our world, Eleanor. Whatever affection he may genuinely hold for you, there will always be men like his cousin, ready to remind him, and everyone else, of the distance between your circumstances and his. I do not say this to discourage you. I say it because I would rather you enter such a thing with clear eyes than blind hope." "I have clear eyes, father," Eleanor said. "I do not imagine this will be simple, but I would rather face something difficult and real than settle for something easy and false, simply because it is safer." Her father studied her for a long moment, something like pride mixing with his obvious worry. "You have always been the sensible one," he said. "I trust you to remain so, even now." The following days brought no further word from Margaret, though Eleanor noticed a distinct coolness whenever they crossed paths at church or in the village, a coolness she suspected had less to do with concern for her welfare and more to do with disappointment that the scandal she had hoped to witness seemed, for the moment, to have been averted. Sophie Ainsley, by contrast, called twice that week simply to sit with her, asking gentle questions and offering quiet reassurance, and Eleanor found herself grateful for a friendship that asked for nothing beyond honest company. Nathaniel returned as promised, though his visits now carried a different quality than before, less like leisurely courtship and more like two people quietly preparing for a battle they both sensed was coming. He told her more about Edmund's history, how his cousin had managed certain estate matters since Nathaniel's father died, how comfortable Edmund had grown in that position, and how threatened he clearly felt by the prospect of a mistress at Ashbourne Hall, who might take a genuine interest in those same matters herself. "He fears I will lessen his influence," Nathaniel said, as they walked one afternoon through the small orchard behind the Whitfield house, the autumn leaves beginning to turn gold and red overhead, "and he is not entirely wrong to fear it. I do not intend to hand away control of everything that touches my family's future to a man who spreads falsehoods among frightened tenants to serve his own comfort. Then he has more reason than ever to see me gone, Eleanor said, watching a leaf spiral down between them and settle at her feet. He has reason, Nathaniel agreed, but not power, whatever he may believe otherwise. The estate is mine, Eleanor, not his, and no scheme he invents will change that simple fact. She wanted to believe the matter could be settled so plainly, but something in the back of her mind, some quiet, practical part of her that had spent years managing her own family's modest affairs, understood that men like Edmund rarely accepted defeat gracefully on the first attempt. Whatever peace they had found that evening at her door was, she suspected, only a pause before the next difficulty arrived, and she found herself, walking beside Nathaniel through the golden orchard light, bracing herself quietly for whatever that difficulty might turn out to be. That evening, after Nathaniel had gone, Eleanor sat with her sisters in the small parlor, and for once, neither Charlotte nor Alice teased her about the Duke's continued attention. Instead, Charlotte took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Whatever happens," Charlotte said, "I am glad you did not let Margaret's cruelty convince you to give up on something that might make you happy. She has never once wished happiness on anyone but herself." Eleanor smiled, grateful for her sister's uncharacteristic seriousness, and allowed herself, just for that evening, to believe that whatever storms were still gathering on the horizon, she would not have to weather them entirely alone. At Ashbourne Hall, however, Edmund was not spending his evenings in quiet reflection. He sat alone in his own chambers, a small suite of rooms he had occupied for years and had come to think of, quietly and without ever saying so aloud, as belonging to him by right of long service. He turned over in his mind every argument Nathaniel had dismissed so easily, searching for some new approach that might succeed where false rumors among the tenants had failed. He thought of the family solicitor, a cautious man named Mr. Pratt who had handled the estate's legal matters for decades and who might, Edmund reasoned, be persuaded that a marriage to a woman of no fortune could create complications for the estate's inheritance that a duke in the grip of new affection might not fully consider. He thought too of certain relations in town, minor nobility who owed Edmund small favors and who might be convinced to spread doubt about Eleanor's suitability in circles far more influential than the county gossip that had already failed to end the courtship. It was not violence he considered, nor anything so crude as physical harm. Edmund was, above all things, a careful man, and careful men understood that reputation and doubt were sharper instruments than any blade, capable of cutting a courtship apart thread by thread until nothing remained but suspicion and exhaustion on both sides. He poured himself another glass of brandy, watching the fire burn low in the grate, and told himself that Nathaniel would thank him eventually, once the foolish infatuation had run its course and the estate remained safely in capable hands, whatever cost the process might exact from a plain countrywoman who had no notion yet of how determined her opposition truly was. The solicitor's letter arrived at Ashbourne Hall on a gray morning, and Nathaniel had barely broken the seal before he understood exactly whose hand had guided its contents, even though the signature at the bottom belonged to Mr. Pratt alone. The letter raised careful, formally worded concerns about the implications of a marriage to a woman without significant fortune or connection, citing obscure precedents about estate inheritance and tenant confidence, precedents that Nathaniel recognized immediately as manufactured anxieties rather than genuine legal obstacles. He read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each careful, poisonous sentence, then set it down and sent for Edmund directly. "You went to Pratt," Nathaniel said, the moment his cousin entered the study. It was not a question. Edmund did not bother denying it. "I went to a man whose duty it is to protect this estate's interests. If that duty happens to align with common sense, I see no reason to apologize for it. You went to frighten an old family solicitor into writing me a letter designed to make me doubt myself," Nathaniel said. "I have told you once already, Edmund. I will not tell you again with the same patience." "Patience," Edmund repeated, something bitter creeping into his voice. "You speak to me of patience, when you have shown none in this entire affair, throwing away every sensible consideration for a woman you have known scarcely 2 months. I have served this family faithfully for 15 years, Nathaniel. I have managed accounts, settled disputes, protected this estate from every manner of difficulty since your father died, and left you far too young to understand what such protection required. And you would risk all of it, all of my work, for a passing infatuation with a plain country girl who caught your eye during an inconvenient carriage accident." Something in Nathaniel went very still and very cold. "You will not speak of her again in that manner, in my presence," he said quietly. "And you will understand, clearly and finally, that whatever service you have given this family, It does not entitle you to determine who I marry. I have made my decision. I intend to ask Eleanor Whitfield to be my wife. And no letter from Pratt, no rumor spread among tenants, no scheme you devise in these rooms will change that decision. If you cannot accept it, I will find someone else to manage the estate's affairs, someone whose loyalty extends to my choices as well as my fortune. Edmund's face went pale, then flushed with something between anger and fear, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Whatever calculations moved behind his eyes, he seemed, for the first time since this entire affair began, to understand that Nathaniel's patience truly had reached its limit, and that further resistance risked costing him everything he had spent years building. As you wish, Edmund said finally, his voice tight. I hope for your sake that your judgment proves sounder than mine fears it to be. He left the room without waiting for a response, and Nathaniel stood alone by the window for a long while afterward, watching the gray morning light move slowly across the grounds, before finally calling for his horse to be saddled. He rode to the Whitfield house that same afternoon, arriving without warning, though by now such unannounced visits had become familiar enough that the household no longer scrambled in surprise at the sound of his carriage, or in this case, his horse, coming up the drive. Eleanor met him in the garden, where she had been cutting late roses before the frost took them, and something in his expression, a mixture of determination and unguarded feeling she had rarely seen him show so openly, made her set down her shears at once. Has something happened? She asked. Something has been decided, Nathaniel said, though not by anyone but myself. Finally, after too many weeks of allowing others to whisper doubts I never truly shared. He took her hand, the roses forgotten in the basket beside them, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. I have known since the night my carriage broke down on your father's road that you were unlike anyone I had met before, he said. I have spent these past months watching every whisper and every doubt try to convince me otherwise, and I have found, each time, that my regard for you only grew steadier for having been tested. I do not offer you a title, Eleanor, though a title comes with what I ask. I offer you a life built honestly, with someone who values your mind and your steadiness above every fashionable quality society claims to prize instead. Will you marry me? For a moment, Eleanor could not speak at all, the weight of the question settling over her with a force she had not fully prepared for, despite every quiet hope she had allowed herself these past weeks. She thought of Margaret's cruel whispers, of her mother's careful warnings, of every voice that had told her, in one way or another, that a plain woman with no fortune could never truly hold a duke's genuine affection, and she thought of every moment since the broken carriage wheel that had proven those voices wrong. Yes, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Yes, I will marry you. Nathaniel's careful composure broke into something warmer than she had ever seen from him, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his usually solemn face entirely, and for a long moment neither of them said anything further, simply standing together in the garden among the last roses of the season, aware that everything about their lives had just shifted irrevocably. News of the engagement spread through the county within days, faster even than the earlier rumors of wagers and jokes had traveled. Eleanor's mother wept with a mixture of joy and disbelief. Her father shook Nathaniel's hand with genuine warmth, and her sisters could not stop asking questions about wedding dates and ceremonies, their earlier teasing now replaced with unguarded excitement. But not everyone received the news with such generous spirit. Margaret arrived within 2 days, her face carefully arranged into an expression of congratulation that did nothing to hide the fury beneath it. Well, she said, settling into her usual chair, I suppose I owe you an apology for doubting his intentions, though I confess I am still astonished. A duke, choosing a wife with no fortune to offer, no connections to strengthen his position. Society will have a great deal to say about it, I imagine, once the initial surprise wears off. I imagine they will, Eleanor said calmly, refusing to let her cousin's barely concealed resentment dampen the happiness she had earned through months of doubt and difficulty, though I find I care considerably less about their opinions than I once did. Margaret's smile tightened, but she said nothing further, and left soon after with the same brittle composure she had arrived with, though Eleanor suspected the true depth of her cousin's disappointment would only reveal itself in time, in whispers and gossip carefully seated among their wider circle of acquaintances. At Ashbourne Hall, Edmund received the news of the formal engagement with outward resignation, offering a stiff congratulation to Nathaniel that fooled neither of them, though he made no further open attempt to interfere. Whether this represented genuine acceptance or simply a strategic retreat to wait for a better opportunity, Nathaniel could not say with certainty, though he watched his cousin carefully in the weeks that followed, unwilling to assume the danger had entirely passed, simply because the most direct confrontations had ended. For Eleanor, the weeks following the proposal passed in a strange, suspended mixture of joy and apprehension. She was, undeniably, deeply happy, secure at last in a regard she no longer doubted, surrounded by a family delighted at her good fortune. But she was also acutely aware that her engagement to a duke had transformed her, overnight, into a subject of intense public scrutiny, and that the whispers which had followed his courtship would only grow louder and more pointed now that a wedding date loomed on the horizon. She had faced doubt from strangers before. She sensed, with the same quiet steadiness that had carried her through every difficult moment so far, that she would need considerably more of that steadiness in the months ahead, as the full weight of society's judgment turned toward the plain woman who had somehow, against every expectation, become a duke's chosen bride. A fortnight after the engagement was announced, Nathaniel invited Eleanor and her parents to visit Ashbourne Hall for the first time, insisting that she should see the place that would soon become her home, before any further plans were made. The journey took the better part of a day, and Eleanor spent much of it watching the countryside change through the carriage window, the modest farms of her own county giving way gradually to grander estates and wider roads, until at last the hall itself came into view, its stone facade rising imposingly against the autumn sky. "It is larger than I imagined," Eleanor admitted, as the carriage rolled up the long drive. "It felt too large to me as well, when I was young," Nathaniel said. "My father used to say a house should never be grander than the people living in it can manage to fill with warmth. I have tried to hold to that, though I confess some of the older wings remain rather cold and unused." They were met at the entrance by a small assembly of household staff, and by Edmund himself, standing slightly apart from the others with an expression of careful neutrality that did not quite disguise the tension beneath it. He greeted Eleanor's parents with practiced courtesy, and Eleanor with a bow just formal enough to avoid open rudeness while making clear, through some subtle chill in his manner, that her presence in this house was not something he had reconciled himself to. "Miss Whitfield," Edmund said, "I trust your journey was comfortable." "It was, thank you," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze steadily, refusing to let his coolness unsettle her. "Ashbourne Hall is even finer than I had been told." "It has stood for many generations," Edmund said, "built and maintained by people who understood precisely what such an inheritance required to protect it. I hope you will come to understand that as well, in time." The remark carried a faint edge beneath its polite surface, and Nathaniel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though he said nothing in front of the assembled staff, choosing instead to guide Eleanor's parents toward the entrance with practiced ease. Eleanor, walking a step behind, caught Edmund's eye once more before following, and understood, without either of them needing to say another word, that whatever peace had settled over the surface of things, the deeper current of his resentment had not been resolved, only postponed. The tour of the house that followed was, despite this undercurrent, genuinely wonderful. Nathaniel showed her the library first, correctly guessing it would please her more than any of the grander formal rooms, and Eleanor found herself running her fingers along shelves of books that stretched from floor to ceiling, entire collections on subjects she had only ever read about in borrowed volumes. He showed her the gardens next, already preparing for winter but still beautiful in their structured design, and the stables, where he introduced her personally to several horses he clearly held great affection for, including, to her quiet delight, the very gray horse whose injured leg she had once tended on the road outside her father's gate. "You kept him," she said softly, running her hand along the horse's neck. "I could hardly send away the creature responsible for bringing us together," Nathaniel said, and Eleanor laughed, the sound easing some of the tension that had settled over her since Edmund's cool greeting at the door. That evening, over a formal dinner that Eleanor navigated with more confidence than she expected, given how carefully she had studied such etiquette in preparation, Edmund said little, though his silence felt more calculating than sullen, as though he were simply waiting, patiently, for some future moment when his objections might carry more weight than they currently did. Eleanor noticed her father watching Edmund closely throughout the meal, and later that night, as the household settled for sleep, her father found a quiet moment to speak with her alone. "That cousin of his does not wish you well," her father said plainly. "I have seen enough men like him in my dealings over the years to recognize the type. He smiles, and he bows, and underneath it all, he is calculating precisely how much trouble you might yet cause him." "I know," Eleanor said. "Nathaniel has told me everything. I do not expect Edmund's objections to end simply because the engagement has been announced." "Then be careful," her father said, "and know that whatever comes, you do not face it without support. Your mother and I are proud of you, Eleanor, prouder than I know how to properly express. Whatever difficulties this position brings, I trust you to meet them the same way you have met every difficulty so far, with far more sense than the rest of us combined." Eleanor embraced her father, grateful beyond words for his steady confidence, and though she slept uneasily that night in the unfamiliar grandeur of Ashbourne Hall, she woke the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose, understanding clearly now that whatever public scrutiny and private scheming still lay ahead, she would meet it as the same woman who had once calmly freed frightened horses from a wrecked carriage, refusing to be shaken by circumstances however overwhelming they first appeared. The glass of wine tipped over the moment Eleanor reached for it, spilling dark red across the white tablecloth and onto the hem of her new gown, and the laughter that rippled through the ballroom told her, before she even looked up, that the spill had not been an accident. She had been standing near the edge of the dance floor at Lady Pembroke's Grand Autumn Ball, the first major society event she had attended since the engagement was formally announced, when a young woman she barely recognized had brushed past her with just enough force to knock the glass from her hand. The woman offered a quick, insincere apology and moved on before Eleanor could respond, but the damage, both to her gown and to her composure, was already done, and several nearby guests exchanged knowing looks that made clear the collision had been deliberate. "How clumsy of her," someone murmured, just loud enough to be overheard. "Though I suppose Miss Whitfield must grow accustomed to standing in places she was never quite meant to occupy." Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral as a servant hurried over with a cloth to blot the worst of the stain, though inside, humiliation burned hot and immediate. This was not the first such incident of the evening. She had arrived at the ball on Nathaniel's arm, greeted with polite smiles from the hosts and a wave of whispers from nearly everyone else. Whispers she caught in fragments as she passed through the crowded rooms. Some questioned how long the engagement would truly last. Others speculated openly about whether she had somehow trapped the Duke through calculated scheming, since no other explanation seemed plausible to minds convinced that beauty and fortune were the only currencies worth anything in matters of the heart. Nathaniel, dancing at that moment with Lady Pembroke's daughter as courtesy required, could not see the incident with the wine glass, and Eleanor chose not to seek him out immediately, unwilling to appear as though she required rescue from every small cruelty the evening produced. She retreated instead to a quiet alcove near the tall windows, hoping for a moment to collect herself before facing the crowded room again. It was there that Lady Winslow found her, a formidable older woman known throughout the county for her sharp tongue and her complete indifference to anyone's opinion of her own conduct. Eleanor braced herself for another cutting remark, but Lady Winslow's expression, when she arrived, held something closer to curiosity than malice. "You handled that spilled wine with more grace than I expected," Lady Winslow said, settling herself into a nearby chair without invitation. "Most young women in your position would have either wept or fled the room entirely. You didn't either." "I saw no reason to give anyone the satisfaction," Eleanor said carefully. Lady Winslow studied her for a long moment. "I have heard a great many opinions about you these past months, Miss Whitfield, most of them unflattering, and nearly all of them formed by people who have never exchanged more than 10 words with you in their lives. I find that sort of judgment tiresome. Tell me plainly why you believe the Duke has chosen you, since everyone else in this room seems to have already decided the answer for themselves." Eleanor considered the question seriously, aware that Lady Winslow's opinion, once formed, carried considerable weight throughout society. "I could not say why he chose me over any other woman," she said honestly. "I only know that he has never once asked me to be anything other than what I am, and that in the months I have known him, he has shown me more honesty than most people in this room have shown me in a lifetime of polite acquaintance. If that is not sufficient reason for a marriage, I confess I do not know what would be." Something shifted in Lady Winslow's expression, a flicker of genuine respect replacing her earlier skepticism. "That is a better answer than I expected," she said. "Perhaps a more honest one than half the marriages made in this room for considerably worse reasons." The conversation might have ended there, quietly and without further incident, had Margaret not chosen that exact moment to approach, flanked by 2 young ladies from town, whom Eleanor recognized as recent additions to Margaret's circle of admirers. Margaret's smile, as always, did not reach her eyes. "Eleanor," Margaret said brightly, loud enough to draw attention from several nearby guests, "I heard about your unfortunate accident with the wine. How dreadful. Though I suppose one must expect such things, moving in circles one was never quite raised to navigate. Society has its own particular rhythms, does it not? And not everyone learns them easily, however hard they might try." The barb was delivered with such practiced sweetness that several onlookers actually smiled, mistaking cruelty for wit, and Eleanor felt the familiar sting of humiliation rise in her chest, sharper this time because it came in front of Lady Winslow, whose good opinion she had only just begun to earn. For months, Eleanor had absorbed such remarks quietly, telling herself that dignity meant silence, that rising above cruelty required simply enduring it without complaint. But something in her, perhaps worn thin by months of accumulated whispers, perhaps strengthened by Nathaniel's steady faith in her, finally refused to stay silent any longer. "You are right, Margaret," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady enough to carry to the small crowd that had gathered nearby. "I was not raised to navigate rooms like this one, where a woman's worth is measured by how prettily she can wound someone in public without appearing unkind herself. I was raised instead to manage a household honestly, to speak truthfully even when silence would be easier, and to treat people with the same respect regardless of their fortune or their title. I confess I find that upbringing considerably more useful than knowing precisely which cruel remark will draw the loudest laughter from a room full of strangers." A ripple of surprised silence spread through the small crowd, several guests exchanging startled glances, clearly unaccustomed to seeing the quiet, unassuming Miss Whitfield speak with such calm, unflinching directness. Margaret's carefully composed smile faltered, color rising in her cheeks as she realized, perhaps for the first time, that her usual weapons had found no purchase this time. "I only meant to offer friendly advice," Margaret said stiffly, though the words carried none of their earlier confidence. "I am certain you did," Eleanor said, her tone gentle now, almost kind, which somehow made the response land with even greater force. "Though I have noticed, Margaret, that your friendly advice has always seemed to arrive precisely when it might cause the most damage. I hope, one day, you find as much satisfaction in your own happiness as you seem to find in questioning mine." Margaret retreated without further reply, her two young companions trailing after her with expressions of poorly concealed amusement, and Lady Winslow, watching the entire exchange with evident delight, let out a short, approving laugh. "Well," Lady Winslow said, "I believe that is the first time I have seen anyone silence that particular young woman so thoroughly. You may yet manage this new world of yours better than half the women who consider themselves its natural inhabitants, Miss Whitfield." Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the remainder of the ball, and by the time Nathaniel found her again, having finally extricated himself from the demands of courtesy dances and polite conversation, several guests were already regarding Eleanor with newfound curiosity, rather than dismissive pity. "I understand something significant happened while I was occupied elsewhere," Nathaniel said, taking her hand as they stepped toward the terrace doors, seeking a moment of privacy from the crowded room. "Your cousin has a great many admirers in this room," Eleanor said dryly, describing the incident with the wine glass, and the exchange with Margaret that followed, watching Nathaniel's expression shift from concern to something like fierce pride as she spoke. "I should have stayed closer," he said when she finished. "I did not need rescuing," Eleanor said. "I have spent my entire life being underestimated, Nathaniel. I have grown rather practiced at defending myself, even if I have not always chosen to do so as openly as I did tonight." "No," he agreed, "you did not need rescuing. But I am sorry all the same that you were made to face it without me at your side." They stood together on the quiet terrace, the sounds of the ball muffled behind the glass doors, and Nathaniel spoke then of something he had been considering for some time, a plan to address the whispers and doubts more directly than either of them had yet attempted. He proposed hosting a formal gathering of their own at Ashbourne Hall before the wedding, inviting not only their closest family but a wider circle of society, an opportunity for Eleanor to be seen clearly, in her own right, managing the responsibilities of the house she would soon inherit, rather than simply enduring judgment at events hosted by others. "Let them see you as I see you," he said. "Let them watch you manage a household, converse intelligently, extend genuine hospitality, and draw their own conclusions from that, rather than from cruel stories invented by people who have never bothered to know you at all." Eleanor considered the suggestion carefully. The prospect of hosting such an event, under the scrutiny of a society already primed to doubt her, was daunting, but she recognized also the wisdom in Nathaniel's plan. Whispers thrived in absence, in the space where people filled uncertainty with their own assumptions. A direct, confident presence, she suspected, might do more to silence the doubt than any amount of quiet endurance ever could. "I will do it," she said finally, "though I imagine your cousin will find some way to make the preparations difficult." "Let him try," Nathaniel said. "I have grown considerably less patient with his interference than I once was, and I do not intend to let his resentment shape a single moment of what should be a joyful occasion for us both." They returned to the ball soon after, and though the whispers had not entirely vanished by evening's end, something had shifted in the room's collective assessment of the plain young woman who had somehow captured a duke's genuine regard. Lady Winslow in particular made a point of speaking warmly with Eleanor before departing, a gesture that several other guests noticed and, in the following days, quietly began to imitate, softening their own opinions to align more closely with a woman whose approval carried considerable social weight. Margaret, for her part, avoided Eleanor entirely for the remainder of the evening, though the cold, calculating look she directed toward her cousin's retreating figure suggested the humiliation of that public exchange had not been forgotten, and would, in time, seek some further outlet for its resentment, whatever form that outlet eventually took. The gathering at Ashbourne Hall took place 3 weeks later, and Eleanor spent much of that time preparing with a thoroughness that surprised even Nathaniel's own household staff, who had grown accustomed to overseeing such events with little guidance from anyone beyond the housekeeper. Eleanor reviewed menus personally, consulted with the gardeners about which late blooms might still be arranged for the tables, and spent an entire afternoon with the housekeeper discussing which rooms should be opened for the evening and which required additional attention before guests arrived. Edmund, observing this activity with barely concealed skepticism, made a point of questioning several of her decisions in front of the staff, suggesting a different wine, a different arrangement of seating, a different order of events, each suggestion delivered with just enough plausible reasoning to make outright refusal appear unreasonable. Eleanor met each challenge calmly, considering his suggestions on their merits rather than dismissing them out of pride, occasionally adopting one when it genuinely improved her plans, but refusing to be moved when she believed her own judgment sound. By the third such exchange, conducted in the hallway outside the dining room while footmen carried linens back and forth around them, Edmund's composure had begun to fray at the edges. "You seem very certain of yourself, for someone who has managed nothing grander than a modest country household," he said, his tone carefully polite, but the words themselves considerably less so. "I have managed accounts, servants, disputes, and a family of 5, on considerably less than what this house spends on candles alone in a single week," Eleanor said evenly. "I do not claim to know everything about a house of this size, Mr. Ashbourne, and I have welcomed your guidance where it has proven useful, but I would ask you to trust that I am capable of learning the rest, rather than assuming incapacity simply because my education did not include a title at birth." Edmund said nothing further, though something in his expression suggested her steady confidence unsettled him more than open hostility might have. He left her to her preparations after that, though Eleanor noticed him watching from a distance more than once in the days that followed, as though searching for some crack in her composure he might yet exploit. The evening of the gathering arrived clear and cold, the hall lit warmly against the early winter darkness, and Eleanor moved through the preparations with a steadiness that belied the nervousness churning beneath her calm exterior. She greeted each arriving guest personally, standing beside Nathaniel at the entrance, offering genuine warmth rather than the practiced, distant courtesy many had expected from a woman thought to be marrying above her station. She spoke with the older gentleman about matters of estate management, drawing on everything she had learned both from her own father's holdings and from her recent study of Ashbourne's particular circumstances. And she spoke with the ladies about subjects ranging from literature to charitable work, refusing to limit herself to the shallow pleasantries some had clearly expected from someone of her background. Lady Winslow arrived early and stayed close throughout much of the evening, quietly steering conversations in Eleanor's favor whenever a guest's tone edged toward condescension, her considerable social influence working in Eleanor's favor exactly as Nathaniel had hoped it might. By the time dinner was served, the general mood of the room had shifted noticeably from cautious curiosity to genuine, if reluctant, admiration, as guest after guest found themselves engaged in conversation with a woman considerably sharper and more capable than the rumors had led them to expect. It was during dinner itself that the evening's true test arrived. Edmund, seated near the head of the table by virtue of his position within the household, raised a question during a lull in conversation that carried more challenge than genuine curiosity beneath its polite phrasing. "Miss Whitfield," he said, loud enough for much of the table to hear, "I understand you have taken quite an interest in estate matters these past weeks. Tell me, what would you propose doing about the tenant farms along the eastern boundary, where the soil has grown poor after years of the same rotation? I ask only because I have wrestled with the problem myself for some time without finding a satisfactory solution." The question was, Eleanor understood immediately, designed either to expose her ignorance before the assembled guests or, should she attempt an answer, to invite Edmund's swift correction and public humiliation. But it happened that the problem he described was one she had studied extensively in the very agricultural volume that had first caught Nathaniel's attention in her father's parlor, months before, and she answered without hesitation, describing a rotation system involving clover and root vegetables that would restore the soil's fertility over several seasons, while still providing the tenants with usable crops throughout the transition. "I read of a similar approach being tried with considerable success in the northern counties," she added, though I would want to examine the specific composition of the soil along your eastern boundary before recommending it outright. Perhaps Mr. Ashbourne and I might review the matter together, given his considerably longer familiarity with those particular fields." The gracious inclusion of Edmund in her answer, offered without any visible resentment despite the obvious trap his question had represented, drew quiet approval from several guests at the table, including Lady Winslow, who caught Eleanor's eye with unmistakable admiration. Edmund, cornered by his own question and unable to object without appearing petty in front of the assembled company, could only offer a stiff acknowledgement before the conversation moved elsewhere, his earlier confidence considerably diminished. By the end of the evening, as guests began departing into the cold night, the whispers that followed Eleanor were noticeably different in character than those that had trailed her at Lady Pembroke's ball weeks before. Several ladies complimented her warmly on the evening's arrangements. Several gentlemen sought her opinion once more before leaving, treating her now as a woman of genuine substance rather than a curiosity to be quietly pitied. Nathaniel, watching the transformation unfold throughout the evening, found himself filled with a quiet, fierce pride that he made no attempt to hide once the last guests had gone, and they stood together in the emptying hall. "You did more tonight than silence doubt," he said. "You proved every unkind assumption about you entirely wrong, in front of the very people most invested in believing them true." "I only answered honestly," Eleanor said, though the warmth in her chest at his obvious pride was undeniable. "I did not do it to prove anything to them, Nathaniel. I did it because it was the truth." "Perhaps," he said, "but sometimes the truth, spoken plainly and without apology, proves more persuasive than any argument crafted specifically to convince. I believe after tonight that fewer people in this county will underestimate you quite so easily again." Edmund, retreating to his own chambers once the last of the guests had departed, sat alone with his brandy once more, though this time his thoughts carried a different weight than they had after previous confrontations. The woman Nathaniel intended to marry had proven, publicly and undeniably, considerably more capable than Edmund had allowed himself to believe, and for the first time since this entire affair began, a quiet, unwelcome doubt crept into his own certainty that his cousin had made a terrible mistake. Whether that doubt would soften his resistance or simply drive him toward more desperate measures remained, even to Edmund himself, entirely uncertain. The chapel bells had not yet begun to ring when the messenger arrived at Ashbourne Hall, breathless from hard riding, carrying news that threatened to unravel everything just 2 days before the wedding. Eleanor was in the small sitting room reviewing final arrangements with the housekeeper when Nathaniel entered, his face drawn tight with an expression she had rarely seen from him, not since the night he had confronted Edmund over the false rumors spread among the tenants. "What has happened?" she asked, rising immediately. "Edmund has gone to London," Nathaniel said. "He has approached the family solicitor there, along with several members of the wider family council, who hold some limited say over matters of significant estate decisions, arguing that our marriage should be delayed pending a formal review of the succession arrangements. He claims, apparently, that a marriage of this nature requires additional legal safeguards to protect the estate's long-term interests." "Can he actually delay it?" Eleanor asked, her heart sinking despite her effort to remain calm. "He has no legal authority to prevent the marriage outright," Nathaniel said, "but he has enough influence among certain relations to create difficulty, enough doubt to force an inquiry that could delay the wedding by weeks, possibly months, while lawyers argue over precedents that have little genuine bearing on the matter. It is, I believe, a final attempt to separate us before it becomes impossible to undo." Eleanor sat back down slowly, absorbing the weight of this new threat. After everything they had already endured, the whispers, the public cruelty, the careful, patient work of proving herself capable in front of a skeptical society, the prospect of losing everything now, mere days before the wedding, to a legal maneuver orchestrated by a bitter, resentful cousin, felt almost unbearably cruel. "What will you do?" she asked. "I will go to London myself," Nathaniel said. "Tonight, if necessary. I will not allow Edmund to manufacture a delay through family relations, who have no genuine stake in this decision, beyond old loyalties and older resentments. But Eleanor, I must ask something of you as well, something that may prove difficult." "Anything," she said. "Come with me," he said, "not to hide behind my arguments in London, but to stand before that family council yourself, to let them see exactly who you are, rather than allow Edmund to describe you in whatever unflattering terms serve his purposes. I believe, after everything you managed at our gathering here, that you may prove more persuasive in that room than any argument I could construct alone." Eleanor did not hesitate long before agreeing, though the prospect of facing a room full of skeptical, influential relations on such short notice with the wedding itself hanging in the balance, filled her with an anxiety she worked hard to keep from her voice. They departed for London that same evening, traveling through the night to arrive before Edmund could fully entrench his position among the family council members he had gathered. The meeting took place 2 mornings later, in a formal chamber at the London townhouse belonging to one of the more senior family relations, a stern older man named Lord Carow, who held considerable sway among the extended Ashbourne family despite having no direct authority over Nathaniel's own decisions. Edmund arrived early, clearly startled to see Nathaniel and Eleanor already present when he entered, his careful composure faltering visibly for just a moment before he recovered himself. "I had not expected you to travel so quickly," Edmund said. "I had not expected you to travel to London at all without informing me first," Nathaniel replied evenly, "given that we discussed this exact subject at length only weeks ago, and I believed the matter settled." Lord Carow called the small gathering to order, and Edmund presented his case with careful, practiced arguments about the importance of protecting estate interests, citing precedents from decades past where marriages made in haste had created lasting complications for family fortunes. He spoke without ever directly insulting Eleanor, choosing instead to raise vague, general concerns about fortune and connection, letting the implications speak for themselves to a room already inclined toward caution regarding unconventional matches. When he finished, Lord Carow turned his attention to Nathaniel. "You understand, of course, why such concerns are raised. It is not a question of doubting your judgment, but of ensuring the estate's continued stability for future generations." "I understand the concern entirely," Nathaniel said, "though I question whether it has been raised in good faith, given that my cousin's objections have persisted through every reasonable answer I have provided these past months, and now arrive here, in this room, only days before my wedding, timed specifically to cause the greatest possible disruption." Lord Carow's gaze shifted to Eleanor, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, watching carefully for the right moment to speak. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "perhaps you might address the council directly. I confess I would value hearing your own perspective on this matter, rather than simply the arguments made on your behalf." Eleanor rose, her heart steady despite the weight of every gaze now turned toward her. "My lord," she began, "I understand the council's concern for the estate's future, and I would share that same concern were our positions reversed. I bring no great fortune to this marriage, nor connections that might strengthen the estate's political standing. What I bring instead is a genuine understanding of what it takes to manage a household honestly, to balance accounts carefully, to treat servants and tenants with fairness rather than simply authority, and to love a man for who he is rather than for what his title might offer me. I have spent these past months proving, to a society eager to doubt me, that capability and character matter considerably more than fortune when it comes to the genuine stability of any household, great or small. I would ask this council to judge me not by the size of my dowry, but by what I have already shown myself capable of, should you take the trouble to inquire honestly among those who have actually witnessed it." A silence followed her words, broken finally by Lord Carow, who studied her for a long moment with an expression that had shifted considerably from his earlier caution. "I have heard, from more than one source, of the gathering you hosted at Ashbourne Hall recently," he said. "Lady Winslow, in particular, spoke rather highly of your conduct that evening, and Lady Winslow is not a woman given to unearned praise." Edmund's expression tightened at this mention, clearly having hoped the council remained unaware of how thoroughly Eleanor had already won over key figures within their own social circle. Lord Carow continued, addressing the room more broadly now. "I see no legal basis for delaying this marriage," he said, "and I confess, having heard Miss Whitfield speak for herself, considerably less appetite for pursuing the matter further than I possessed when I agreed to hear these concerns. Mr. Ashbourne, I believe your objections, however sincerely held, have run their proper course. I would suggest you accept your cousin's decision with whatever grace you can manage, rather than continue a campaign that reflects rather poorly on your own judgment at this point." The other council members murmured their agreement, and Edmund, recognizing the tide had turned decisively against him, could do nothing but accept the verdict with as much composure as he could muster, offering a stiff bow before departing the chamber without further argument. Nathaniel watched him go with an expression more of weary relief than triumph, understanding that whatever resentment still simmered beneath his cousin's careful exterior, the matter had finally, truly been settled. They returned to Ashbourne Hall the following day, the wedding proceeding exactly as planned, delayed by nothing more than the brief journey to London itself. The ceremony took place on a clear winter morning, the chapel filled with family and friends, and a good many curious neighbors who had spent months whispering about the unlikely match, and now came to witness its conclusion for themselves. Eleanor's mother wept through most of the ceremony. Her father stood taller than Eleanor had ever seen him, and her sisters watched with open, unguarded joy as Eleanor walked down the aisle toward the man who had never once, despite every obstacle placed before them, wavered in his regard for her. Charlotte and Alice had spent the morning helping Eleanor dress, fussing over the arrangement of her hair and the fall of her gown with a tenderness that surprised her, given how often they had teased her in earlier years for her lack of interest in such fashionable matters. Charlotte fastened the small string of pearls their mother had worn at her own wedding. Her hands trembling slightly with emotion she tried and failed to hide. "I used to think you did not care for any of this," Charlotte admitted, smoothing a final fold in Eleanor's sleeve. "Weddings, gowns, romance. You always seemed so practical about everything, as though feelings were simply another household matter to be managed sensibly. I did not think such things were meant for me," Eleanor said honestly. "It seemed easier to focus on what I could control, rather than hope for something I believed unlikely to arrive." "And now look at you," Alice said, her eyes bright. "Proof that the unlikely things are sometimes the truest ones." The walk down the aisle felt, to Eleanor, both impossibly long and far too brief, every familiar face along the pews blurring together as she focused instead on Nathaniel waiting at the altar, his expression carrying none of the careful composure he so often showed the wider world, only open, unguarded happiness that steadied her nerves more than any rehearsed vow could have. Sophie Ainsley, seated near the front, caught her eye and offered a small, encouraging smile, and Lady Winslow, further back, nodded with an approval that Eleanor had come to value deeply over the preceding months. The vows themselves were simple, traditional, spoken clearly by both of them without hesitation, and when the ceremony concluded and the chapel bells finally rang out over the cold winter air, the assembled guests rose with genuine warmth, applause, and cheerful voices filling the small stone building, in a way that felt, to Eleanor, like the final quiet answer to every whisper that had once tried to convince her she did not belong in such a moment. The wedding breakfast that followed lasted well into the afternoon, held in the great hall at Ashbourne Hall, decorated with the last hardy blooms the gardens could still provide, and warmed by enormous fires that chased away the winter chill. Lord Carow attended, offering a brief, formal toast that acknowledged, with careful diplomacy, the wisdom the council had ultimately shown in trusting the couple's own judgment over abstract concerns of fortune and connection. Lady Winslow's toast carried rather less diplomacy and rather more genuine affection, praising Eleanor's composure and character, in terms direct enough to make several of the more skeptical guests present visibly reconsider opinions they had held only months before. Margaret attended as well, seated near the back among more distant relations, and though her expression remained carefully composed throughout the ceremony, Eleanor caught her eye once during the vows and saw something there that looked, for the first time in all their years of quiet rivalry, almost like genuine respect, however grudging. The months that followed the wedding brought their own gradual transformation. Eleanor settled into the rhythms of Ashbourne Hall with the same steady competence she had shown from the very beginning, learning the particular demands of a great estate while never losing the practical sensibility that had first caught Nathaniel's attention beside a broken carriage wheel. She worked alongside the household staff rather than simply directing them from a distance, earned the genuine respect of tenants who found her willing to listen to their concerns rather than dismiss them, and slowly, through consistent, honest effort, transformed public perception of herself from a curiosity to be pitied into a duchess genuinely admired throughout the county. Edmund remained at Ashbourne Hall for a time, though his role gradually diminished as Eleanor took on more direct responsibility for matters he had once controlled entirely, and within a year he accepted a position managing a smaller property some distance away, a departure that neither Nathaniel nor Eleanor mourned, though both remained scrupulously polite whenever their paths crossed at family gatherings thereafter. On a quiet evening nearly a year after the wedding, Eleanor stood in the same orchard where Nathaniel had once spoken of Edmund's resentment, watching the last golden light of autumn settle over the grounds that had become, genuinely and completely, her home. Nathaniel found her there, as he often did in the quiet hours after the day's business concluded, and stood beside her without speaking for a long moment, simply watching the light fade together. "Do you ever think of that broken carriage wheel?" he asked eventually, "and wonder how differently things might have gone, had it held together just a little longer?" "I think of it often," Eleanor admitted, "though I have come to believe some things happen exactly as they must, however unlikely they first appear. A broken wheel, a frightened horse, a stranger with mud on his boots kneeling beside me in the road. It seems such a small thing to have changed everything." "Not so small," Nathaniel said, taking her hand. "I think I knew, standing in that road, that I had found something I had not even realized I was searching for. Everyone else saw a plain country woman with no fortune to offer. I saw someone who faced a genuine crisis with calm hands and clear thinking. who argued with me about crop rotation as though nothing in the world could intimidate her, and who has proven, every single day since, exactly how wrong the world was to ever call her plain. Eleanor smiled, leaning into him as the last light faded over the orchard, and thought of every whisper, every cruel remark, every doubt she had once carried about her own worth. All of it settled now into a quiet, steady peace that no title or fortune could have provided on its own. She had come to Ashbourne Hall as the plain lady the county had long ago dismissed, and she remained there now, not because the world had changed its mind about beauty or fortune, but because she had never once needed the world's permission to know her own value, standing steady through every storm, until even the harshest doubters had no choice left but to see her clearly at last. Later that same evening, as they walked back toward the house together, Nathaniel mentioned a letter that had arrived that morning, one Eleanor had not yet had time to read. It came from Sophie Ainsley, who had married a modest gentleman from a neighboring county earlier that spring, and now wrote with news of her own quiet happiness, along with an invitation for Eleanor and Nathaniel to visit once the winter roads improved. Eleanor read the letter twice by candlelight that night, smiling at Sophie's familiar, gentle humor, grateful that the friendship formed during her most difficult months had endured well beyond the uncertainty that first tested it. Her family visited often throughout that first year, her father delighting in long conversations with Nathaniel about estate matters neither of them ever seemed to tire of discussing, her mother slowly growing more comfortable with the grandeur of Ashbourne Hall until she moved through its halls with something approaching ease, and Charlotte and Alice filling the quieter rooms with laughter whenever they came to stay, reminding Eleanor of the modest, warm household she had grown up in, a household whose lessons in honesty and practical care had, in the end, proven more valuable to her new life than any fashionable accomplishment she had once believed herself to lack. Even Margaret's cold rivalry softened gradually with time, worn down not by any grand reconciliation, but by the simple, accumulating evidence of Eleanor's genuine happiness and capability, until their exchanges, while never especially warm, lost the sharpest edges that had once defined them. Eleanor found she no longer needed Margaret's approval, nor anyone else's, to feel certain of her place in the world, a certainty that had grown slowly but surely from the moment a broken carriage wheel first brought her face to face with a duke who saw past every plain assumption others had made about her. Standing now at the wide windows of Ashbourne Hall on quiet evenings, watching the seasons turn over grounds she had come to know as intimately as her father's modest fields, Eleanor understood that the county would likely always remember the story of how she came to be there, the plain lady who married a duke, repeated and reshaped many times over in drawing rooms and letters throughout the years to come. But she no longer measured her worth by how that story was told. She measured it instead by the steady warmth of the man beside her, by the honest respect she had earned tenant by tenant and guest by guest, and by the quiet certainty that whatever the world had once called her, she had never, not for a single moment since that broken wheel in the road, been anything less than exactly enough.